Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for being with us today in this exceptionally weird format to discuss how to reduce packaging waste and introduce environmentally friendly alternatives in the legal cannabis industry in Canada. Let me start off by introducing our team. My colleague Erika will explain the context of our challenge and present one of our recommendations. Paisley will discuss our process and present one of our longer-term recommendations. And Omar will give you some insights into the cannabis industry and give you a sense of how the 2015 campaign promise to legalize cannabis has inadvertently led to huge amounts of plastic pollution.
Thanks, Lina. Before we begin, we've been working on this challenge for the past 6 months and have many people to thank. We'd like to acknowledge our sponsor, Health Canada, who remained engaged in our research while they were at the heart of the COVID pandemic. All the cannabis producers we interviewed, particularly Canopy Growth Corporation. Hilary Lieberman from Canna Supplies has been incredibly generous with her time and her expertise, so thank you, Hilary. So many academics and researchers gave us their time and helped us determine if we were asking the right questions. We'd like to thank McGill University and McMaster University in particular. And we really couldn't have done this without the faculty and staff at Max Bell and all of our brilliant colleagues. But most of all, we'd like to acknowledge our coach, Andrew Potter, who helped us frame our thinking on this issue and took many, many Zoom calls from his son's bedroom. So thank you, Andrew. So we look forward to taking your questions after our presentation, and I'm gonna hand it over to Erika.
Thank you, Paisley. On paper, the challenge at the heart of our policy lab is: what policy measures could Health Canada implement to reduce packaging waste and encourage more environmentally friendly packaging for legal cannabis products? But when we began digging deeper, we learned that in practice, the challenge is much bigger than packaging. In 2018, Canada legalized recreational cannabis. Our research was grounded in the objectives of the Cannabis Act to protect public safety, reduce illicit activity, and protect young people. The further we dug in, the more we saw the unintended consequences of legalization. The cannabis industry has unintentionally contributed to virgin plastic manufacturing, consumption, and waste in a big way. Today, it is estimated that a standard 3.5 gram package of dried cannabis comes packaged in more than 70 grams of plastic. Legalization has created packaging waste and plastic pollution. This has hurt the reputation of the government and the industry. From talking to producers, we learned that waste is a result of regulation and the fact that the industry is young and fragile. The real problem we identified is a tension between the promises of legalization and the reality of cautious regulation. If you add a backdrop of climate change and increasing plastic pollution, you can get a sense of what the real policy challenge has been.
Thank you, Erika. In 2015, the Liberal government was elected on a platform to legalize recreational cannabis at a moment when the public was calling for action on climate change. The Cannabis Act regulates the cannabis industry in Canada, but it does not address environmental concerns around packaging and waste. The regulations address packaging appearance, label, excise stamps, and mandate child-resistant packaging. Following these regulations, producers are packaging cannabis in much more plastic than otherwise necessary. A key challenge is that the cannabis industry is forbidden from traditional marketing, similar to the alcohol and tobacco industry. What this meant is that producers cannot differentiate themselves from competing brands or even communicate their environmentally friendly initiative to consumers. We have found that these stringent public health and safety objectives that have guided legalization have inadvertently undermined the government's environmental commitment.
Omar's right. The unintended problem of plastic waste is harming Canada's broader commitments. But why is this a problem? Why should we think about regulating cannabis and plastic waste in the same breath? Each year, the world produces 100 million tons of plastic. That's the equivalent weight of 2 million Montreal Metro cars. The equivalent of 200,000 of those is junked in the world's oceans every year. Plastic pollution is becoming a global crisis and a public health issue. It contributes to climate change and threatens human health, oceans, and marine life. By 2050, the world's oceans will contain more plastic than fish by weight. In 2015, Canada pledged to legalize cannabis. But in the same year, Canada also adopted the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and pledged that material needs would not lead to the over-extraction of resources or to the degradation of environmental resources. In June 2019, Canada announced that it would ban some single-use plastics and hold companies responsible for plastic waste. In its first phase, the ban includes shopping bags, cutlery, and stir sticks. A single-use plastics ban could be introduced as early as next year, though our current public health crisis may lead the government to reevaluate this timeline. When it comes to recycling plastic, any material is technically recyclable if cost is not a concern. However, in practice, there are a lot of other factors that influence recyclability. Despite almost all Canadians having access to some form of local recycling, only 9% of plastic waste generated annually in Canada is recycled. 9%. What happens to the remainder of that? 86% goes to landfills, and 1% is leaked into the environment. The rest is incinerated. To give you a better idea, each percentage weighs the same as 725 Montreal Metro cars, filled with commuters at rush hour. Acting on cannabis waste and plastic pollution ties into bigger commitments that we can't lose sight of.
Thanks, Erika. The more we learned about the cannabis industry, the more it became clear that it was undergoing a period of change. Right now, we are seeing that many producers are experiencing financial upheaval, serious consolidation, and shaky investor confidence. The industry is extremely cost sensitive, and many producers are looking to actively shed expenses. Virgin plastic is widely used in the industry because it is inexpensive. Recycled plastic, cardboard, and composable bags are far more costly. By putting ourselves in the shoes of producers, it became hard to justify the added expense of more environmentally friendly packaging. When you have no way to communicate the benefits to your consumers, producers are reluctant to innovate. Producers are also constrained by labeling standards. What this meant was that packaging is built around the label size and not the actual product. This would drive up waste. Adding to the tension between the aim of legalization and the reality of legalization is a backdrop of climate change, as Erika mentioned. We are seeing that producers are becoming far more risk-averse now and have fewer incentives to innovate on packaging. This gives you a sense of the fuller picture.
Thanks, Omar. So our research led us to 8 strategies designed to balance regulatory and financial burdens while ensuring that the cannabis market is competitive and free to innovate. I'm going to run through a few of these strategies and highlight why we did not recommend them in the end. We learned that black plastic can't be recycled because recycling facilities use scanning technology that can't pick up black or dark colors. Black plastic goes straight to landfills. So we looked at mandating that all plastic going forward be white. This would increase recyclability and post-consumer use. But in the end, the strategy doesn't significantly reduce packaging waste. It just changes the nature of the waste, so we didn't pursue it. Next, we explored a hemp plastic innovation fund. Hemp is a natural byproduct of the cannabis cultivation process and can be repurposed into biodegradable plastics. This is not a strategy that most producers could easily implement. It would require partnerships and significant upfront investment. So we explored recommending an innovation fund to get hemp plastic production off the ground. In the end, we decided that this was outside the scope of most producers' current work, but hemp plastic still has great potential and could be a longer-term solution to waste. It's worthy of further study. Next, we explored how excise stamps are used to track cannabis supply and ensure that duty is paid. Right now, there are 13 excise stamps in Canada, as many as provinces and territories. And we believe that moving to one federal excise stamp would allow cannabis producers to move supply around more easily between parts of the country. This could simplify logistics and cut down on transportation pollution. In the end, we felt that a single excise stamp may be met with resistance from provinces and territories, and it may be complicated to introduce because stamps are administered by the Canada Revenue Agency. We didn't put this forward as a recommendation because the waste reduction potential would be limited. Finally, we explored moving towards a bulk cannabis distribution model. Consumers would bring in their own containers and buy bulk product based on weight. Trained staff would measure and weigh the cannabis product. Cannabis delivered to retail stores could be packaged and transported in larger quantities, and ultimately this recommendation would reduce waste. But it raises health concerns about youth inducement to consume cannabis, and it could be logistically challenging. A bulk barn for cannabis may be a longer-term goal, but we didn't recommend pursuing it now. So I'm going to hand this over to Lina, who will go through some of our recommendations.
Thank you, Paisley. So let me turn to our policy recommendations for Health Canada. Our first observation is that if Canada wishes to achieve the public health and public safety goals of the Cannabis Act, the regulations also have to foster an environment where industry can flourish to provide customers with accessible and affordable products to compete with the illicit market. So this is why our first recommendation really allows for the industry's creativity to kick in and requires the public and private sectors to work together. So that's the introduction of a recycling system in all retail stores, financially supported by the cannabis industry. Technically, this would be referred to as an Extended Producer Responsibility Initiative, an EPR, and it would be coupled with a consignment and recycling system. Simply speaking, that means that the producer, rather than you as a consumer, would be responsible for dealing with packaging after its use. Producers could work with retailers to make sure that all customers have access to recycling bins in stores. This would have two major consequences. Firstly, it'll increase the rates of recycling of cannabis packaging because customers will have direct access and incentives to bin their packaging waste. Secondly, and much more interestingly, it'll incentivize producers to design more environmentally friendly packaging that's easy to reuse and easy to recycle. How would it do that? Well, producers respond to financial cues. When they work with retailers to introduce recycling bins, they'll be able to recoup post-consumer packaging. So after you bin your package, it'll be cleaned and sorted, and producers will actually get those products back, or they'll get recycled materials back. Either way, they can use that in their manufacturing, which will significantly reduce their costs. As an added benefit, this strategy ensures significant savings for taxpayers and municipalities because all materials that are sent back to producers are also materials that are diverted away from public recycling facilities. So maybe this seems a little bit idealistic. So let me reassure you by saying that this is very feasible. It's so feasible, in fact, that it's already being done. In Quebec, the Société Québécoise du Cannabis, the SQDC, and the firm Canopy Growth are developing a partnership alongside the third-party recycler TerraCycle. Through this partnership, all SQDC retailers will provide free-to-user in-store consignment bins, like the ones that you can see on screen. Then the contents will be recycled by TerraCycle. And finally, Canopy will recoup the recycled materials. This is just one example of the introduction of a circular economy with benefits all around. Firstly, the taxpayers get a break. Secondly, the consumers are incentivized to recycle more. Obviously, the industry has this continuous flow of material coming in for manufacturing. Health Canada, as the government regulator, is satisfied that public health and public safety aren't undermined. And most importantly, plastic waste is significantly reduced. Let me pass this on to Erika now, who can go through our second recommendation.
Thanks, Lina. So when cannabis was first legalized, producers really didn't have a lot of time to comply with the Cannabis Act and regulations, including packaging and labeling regulations. As a result, many producers have struggled to find appropriate and affordable materials for their packaging. many have resorted to using multi-material packaging. So what does this mean? Individual materials like cardboard, plastic, or aluminum may be individually recycled, but when they're put together in one container, recycling facilities can't easily or economically recycle it. So what happens to multiple material packaging? It probably ends up in a landfill where it will take 400 years or more to decompose. To move away from multiple materials, we suggest standardizing packaging across the board. This means that standard packages would be made exclusively from one highly and easily recyclable material that can be reused. Packaging from producer A would be interchangeable with that of producer B. This strategy is in line with Health Canada's aim to encourage producers to use innovative and environmentally sound packaging approaches, of course, provided that the requirements and the regulations are satisfied. Having one mandated environmentally friendly packaging model per type of cannabis product would reduce plastic waste and pollution. Harmonizing packaging, like you can see on the screen, would allow third-party recyclers and municipalities to sort and clean packaging in a more cost-effective way. Getting into detail, Health Canada should mandate materials that do not pose risk to human health, come from renewable resources, have a low carbon footprint, and most importantly, can be fully cleaned for reuse and recycling. The ultimate goal would be to create a circular economy for packaging, to avoid incineration and disposal in landfills in nature. It would be sensible for Health Canada to coordinate with Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada to explore materials sourced and produced in Canada, such as zero carbon aluminum. This recommendation would also work hand in hand with the take-back programs that were mentioned by Lina to boost the creation of a circular economy for packaging and its materials. On to Paisley, who will talk about our third recommendation.
Thanks. So I'm going to talk about our most outside the box idea, which is to remove child resistance from some classes of cannabis products. Throughout our research, we learned that the vast majority of cannabis products sold in Canada are dried cannabis and pre-rolled joints. As of April 2020, dried cannabis amounts to 73% of the cannabis products sold in Canada, which is over 5.5 million packaged units. Dried cannabis flower, or bud, contains non-psychoactive THCA. When you consume raw THCA, you don't get any euphoric or therapeutic benefits or effects. It's scientifically agreed upon that THCA products pose little risk of poisoning if consumed raw. It's on par with eating a leafy green. But on the other hand, edibles, soft gels, oils, and concentrates, they contain active THC. When you consume concentrated THC products, you feel the effects. So this is where it gets kind of interesting, which is that when dried cannabis is heated, inactive THCA converts to active THC. If it's not heated or vaporized, it poses little risk. But once it is heated, it can have real effects. The Cannabis Act requires that all cannabis products be sold in child-resistant packaging. Child resistance on chemical products, oral prescriptions, and aspirin-containing products, they've been shown to reduce child mortality and harm. Child resistance is justified for products that are toxic and can lead to poisoning, but the rationale for child resistance weakens when the product doesn't have poisonous or harmful effects. Given that the risk of harm from consuming raw cannabis is low, we recommend dividing products based on whether or not they include psychoactive THC or inactive THCA. This would eliminate the need for child resistance on THCA products like dried flower and pre-rolled joints. To be clear, we don't recommend removing child resistance on high concentration THC products. But removing child resistance on THCA products will hugely increase the range of packaging materials available to producers. It will reduce overall packaging waste and lower packaging cost. So the question is, why aren't producers using non-plastic child resistant packaging now? As Omar mentioned earlier, the cannabis market is undergoing significant consolidation and producers are cost sensitive. Child-resistant packaging that isn't plastic, it does exist, but it comes at a much higher cost. It's typically made of multiple materials, which, as Erika mentioned, hugely reduces recyclability. A cardboard container may appear to be more sustainable, but the inlaid plastic mechanism that makes it child-resistant makes it more likely to be landfilled than recycled. It's not a stretch to suggest that multi-material packaging is a form of greenwashing. If Health Canada is serious about reducing packaging, altering the requirements on 73% of packaged products can have significant impact. Without child resistance, producers could safely package dried cannabis using recycled materials like compostable bags and uncoated cardboard, similar to tobacco products. This would not change any labeling standards or quality control measures. So we recognize that this strategy would expend political capital and require some shifts in thinking. But we believe that public health and public safety can be maintained because science is on the side of THCA having limited potential for harm. It would be a missed opportunity not to consider this strategy because 5.5 million packaged items is huge. This would lead to industry-wide waste reduction and could signal a move away from plastic once and for all.
Thank you, Paisley, and thanks to my colleagues for going over our recommendation. To sum up, I would like to take a moment to review the chart. We have plotted our top recommendations with medium and high waste reduction potential based on the estimated implementation timeline. As you can see, the options with the highest waste reduction potential are standardizing packaging, which could yield upwards of 50% in waste reduction. Second, an extended producer responsibility and recycling system. This could yield upwards of 60% in waste reduction. And lastly, removing child resistance from THCA products. This has the highest waste reduction potential and could yield upwards of 70% in waste reduction. The real takeaway from this chart is that solutions to address waste are available to both the industry and the regulator. We hope that our proposal has framed this issue and provided food for thought on this very complex narrative.
Thank you so much, Omar. So to conclude, one thing that we kept coming back to in our research was that the real challenge was about waste reduction in a highly regulated space and the unintended impacts of designing highly politicized legislation. We also think that the moment is ripe to spark a return to a culture of more circular economies aimed at eliminating waste and favoring responsible and continual reuse of resources. The public is asking for it at home and abroad. We believe that by proactively addressing the reality of cannabis industry waste, Health Canada can mainstream climate action, it can lead on a critical government priority, and it can set an international precedent for other countries looking to legalize. If the calls from the public and the realities of a changing climate are heeded, we believe that it is possible to uphold public safety and public health while meaningfully reducing packaging waste. We want to thank you again for taking the time to listen to us and share in our findings, and we're very happy to take any questions that you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lina and the team. We are going to open up the Q&A period. We are going to begin with Andrew Potter, the team coach, the coach that has followed the team over the course of the last 6 months. And then after Andrew's question, we'll be moving on to anybody from Health Canada. I see Debbie is on the line and Andrea is on the line. If anybody from Health Canada has any questions for the team, we'll then be moving on to you. So if you could begin by turning on your mic and your camera. So Andrew, if you're still with us, there he is.
Hi guys.
And there's the bedroom.
Yeah, there's a bedroom. Yeah, still my son's
He made the bed today.
Yeah, well, yeah. I should probably hide that. Lina, I got a question for you about the EPR consignment model proposal. How much do you think this will be affected or hampered in its effectiveness by the move to online delivery and purchasing of cannabis?
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. That is a great question. So we wondered about that a lot. We struggled with it a little bit. We realized the data shows that essentially when stores have opened, people have used them. So I think the last figure that we saw was that in the first year of legalization, it was about 13% of products that were sold online. So that's a pretty big fraction that's in store. That's the first thing. While it's probably true that COVID is going to affect this trend, the bigger issue in recycling is not that people don't have access. 98% of Canadians have access to recycling. The main problems are confusion. People don't really know whether to recycle. They don't understand the little signs on their products. And as Erika mentioned earlier, there's a limited capacity by recycling facilities in cities to deal with traditional materials, including the black plastics and the multi-layer packaging. The solution comes with EPR, because EPR, which is negotiated with producers, also incentivizes them to create packaging that's more sustainable and more recyclable, as I explained, because of the financial benefits. So ideally, these products are returned to them, but they could also be treated by more traditional recycling facilities. So the government should work, hopefully, to develop very, very simple on-pack messaging, which would create a binary, essentially. So you would look at your product and you would know, is it recyclable, is it not recyclable? And then, as Erika mentioned earlier, that allows for waste reduction because, especially if it's boosted with packaging standardization. So essentially, even consumers who are staying away from stores are going to see changes in the packaging of their products. So that'll help them to better recycle even from home.
Okay.
Thank you, Lina. Thank you, Andrew. We're going to move on to our participants from Health Canada. If we have any questions from Debbie or Andrea, there's Andrea and Debbie.
Hi
Great.
there.
Debbie, do you want to begin, or Andrea?
Sure. Happy if Debbie has something, and then I can chip in after, or I can go first.
Go ahead, Andrea. You're already on a roll.
All right. And sorry, guys, I'm having some technical issues this morning, so I'm on a phone and probably not coming across very well. And I first off wanted to start by thanking all of you for the work, and obviously now that we have your final report, which we received last night, we'll dive into that as well. It's quite a lengthy tome, but I'm sure there'll be lots of good stuff to go through there. And I know you guys have been thinking about this for a while, and we've had some good conversations. And I guess I'd like to go to your out of the box idea, which is very much out of the box. I think you captured very well at various points in the presentation today how you're always trying to balance a series of objectives. And admittedly, the Cannabis Act tries to do that as well, with the protection of public health and safety, the displacement of the illegal market, protection of youth, and a number of other things. And so as we look at that piece, I think you've rightly indicated that it would represent a pretty significant shift, in terms of the government's approach. And I think, it's fair to say that we're still pretty early on in this enterprise, and there still is a lot of education that's necessary, right? So I'm interested for you to talk a little bit about, how that education and communications messaging would play in, right? Because obviously the government would never want to be in a place where we're, seem to be moving away from that commitment to protect youth, right? And to have cannabis that's more accessible, in the home environment to young people or pets or, whatever it might be. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that for me, how you kind of see that playing out and some of the strategies involved. And equally, I'd appreciate some comments about education, public education writ large, because that's always been a fairly significant element of this enterprise, no matter, you know, what aspect we're looking at, right? Whether it's with respect to the health risks associated with using cannabis, or safe storage principles, or you know, how parents can talk to their teens or whatever. So I'd appreciate a little bit more insight on that, because obviously I think all of the elements that you've raised, you know, would necessitate, you know, communication and outreach. So just be interested in your general observations on that.
Hi, Andrea, I'm happy to respond to this one. So our evaluation criteria was grounded in concern for the objectives of the Cannabis Act and what we think would work in practice, and also the potential for waste reduction. So we really tried to balance those in coming up with this outside the box recommendation, and try to see it through a public health and public safety lens. And so in terms of the public messaging, I think you brought up something that we kept coming back to a lot, which is that the cannabis industry is young and novel, and it's changing a lot. And so we see that there's still lots of opportunity to message to the public about cannabis, and especially cannabis safety. And so one of the campaigns that we were looking at specifically is Health Canada's Start Low, Go Slow campaign that came about or accompanied Cannabis 2.0, which is when edibles and high concentration THC products became available. And so we look to that campaign as there's an opportunity in thinking about not only consumption, but also the scientific sort of grounding for consumption. And some of that's mirrored in the Start Low, Go Slow campaign. And so part of the rationale for moving away from child resistance was that the more that we learned about THCA versus THC products and the potential for poisoning, the more it became clear that you can't really, unlike concentrated THC products, you can't really, pardon me, you can't really feel poisonous or harmful effects from consuming raw cannabis. Certainly, it's not really, people don't necessarily want children and animals to consume raw cannabis, but the effect is not, it doesn't confer any psychoactive effects or any therapeutic effects. We found that it's used in some cases in some odd juicing practices. It's used as the equivalent of a fibrous vegetable, but it's not something that if you were to eat raw out of a plastic jar, that would give you any psychoactive effects. So taking that as our foundation, the recommendation is really rooted in what we think aligns with Health Canada's respect for science. And child resistance on a product that doesn't actually have poisonous effects, like non-activated THCA, we felt was unnecessary. And if it was explained to the public from a harm reduction perspective, it could be more widely understood. It doesn't change the fact that, you know, we appreciate that child resistance has some symbolic meaning, but we also looked into the fact that child resistance is not always as effective as we think it is. It's effective up to a certain age, but at a certain point, if a kid is 9 or 10 or, you know, thereabouts, they're dexterous enough to open child resistance, at which point it's more important to transition to education and to transition to having a conversation about why products would be in child resistance, which we saw as a great opportunity in framing this recommendation and the argument that would be made to the public. Similarly, from thinking about political feasibility, because we know that it would be a pretty big shift from the past, we saw that there's a parallel in tobacco products. They don't require child resistance, but it's a pretty problematic comparison to hold up. So we didn't really get into that because we recognize that potential for harm from ingesting like raw cigarettes, for example, you can get mild nicotine poisoning. But we know that there's an inconsistency in child resistant packaging being on some things and not on others based on harm. So we didn't talk too much about that, but it would be something to explore further down the line in terms of crafting messaging around this. And finally, I don't mean to go on too long, but finally, I would add that that child resistance and the need to protect that symbolic child resistance more than anything really does conflict with larger environmental commitments. And we really thought it would be a missed opportunity not to consider the potential impact. And we're not saying you would transform the industry overnight, but with 3/4 of cannabis products being non-active THCA, it really could change not only the reputation, but the retail impression of cannabis in people's minds. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Paisley. Debbie.
Thanks very much, and thank you everybody for all of the research, the work, and the presentation today. Fascinating, and Andrea went where I was going to instinctively go, so I'll go somewhere else as well, but I'll just plant a thought with you that it's interesting from a public policy perspective to look at, you know, the issue you had between dueling public policy files between environment and health. And if I just draw a comparison to where we are with the COVID-19 pandemic and the behaviors that we're seeing now, it is one that makes you perhaps have give pause to which an individual, which society values more when we look at how people are disposing of gloves, masks, and what have you, and creating yet another environmental challenge. So it's an interesting kind of living experiment as to where people's default is when their health is at stake. But I'll move to another question, which is I'm interested by the piece you talked about around incentivizing industry and in fact allowing that innovation and creativity, and that it's already happening in some ways, the example you used with the recycling bins. And I just wonder if there are other ways you think that given the nascent industry, given the nature of the products and what have you, there are other ways to incentivize industry to pick up on that consumer demand for an environmentally healthy approach.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that question. So there are two things that we looked at in looking at industry. First of all, we looked at the industry as a whole. And secondly, we looked at the industry as Omar was describing it with its different players that are undergoing some financial changes and restructuring. So as you mentioned, incentivizing producers to join this kind of system works very easily when there's a financial benefit to them. It works well to propose to producers to create a circular loop because, as I mentioned, they can recover some materials, some packaging for reuse and recycle. That's it's a very promising avenue, and as you mentioned, it's already happening because it is to the financial benefit of the industry generally. One of the problems with that, however, is that the pilot project that I described earlier is a project that's being led by Canopy Growth Corporation, which is one of the leaders of the Canadian legal industry. And so that doesn't take into account the fact that there are some smaller players in the game, and there is a lot of difficulty to maintain their financial viability given the situation today. So that's why we recommended both the EPR and recycling program and packaging standardization, because in doing both of those things, perhaps in separate timeframes, but over the next couple of years, you can incentivize the industry generally, but also you can even out the varying economic capabilities between the different industry players, which means that even the smaller firms will be able to benefit from these changes. So in the example that Erika mentioned earlier, packaging standardization, any type of packaging would be the same for the entire industry per type of product. So if you sell product A, regardless of the kind of firm that you are, you can benefit from getting that product back to reuse or then to recycle. In terms of EPR, it's the same thing. If a project is implemented countrywide that would benefit all players and not just the bigger ones, then all firms will receive back materials and packaging for reuse and recycle. So the advantage of that, and we really did struggle with this because of the realities of the legal industry, which, as Omar mentioned, are not, the industry isn't where, critiques anticipated a few years ago. So we really did look at that. And that's why we sort of developed in those two strategies a way to even out the varying economic capacities, because we really want every industry player to be able to take part. And that's the reason that Health Canada should lead both of those strategies with provinces and territories to ensure that it's not the bigger firms taking charge alone and the smaller firms not benefiting. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Debbie, for that question, and Andrea as well. We're going to move on to questions from the faculty. So Chris and Jen and Taylor and anybody else from the faculty who is online, if you have a question, please let me know. And then after that, we will move on to questions from the general audience. So if you are a student or another participant on the call and you have a question, please either raise your hand or send me a little message on the chat, and we will try to get to your question, even though we will be completing this call at noon. So Chris, you have a question.
I actually have two questions. Thank you very much, team, for that presentation. It was great and a great discussion. And I particularly liked when you discussed the options that you considered but dismissed and why you dismissed them. I thought that was great. So I've got two questions. So the first question is about the outside the box recommendation, which I thought was great. So I don't have a lot of experience in my life with THC or THCA. So it was great to learn this, but I want to make sure that I understand this. So if we're talking about child protection, which I assume is not about teenagers, it's about toddlers, right? So let me know if I'm wrong on that. But the logic here is THCA by itself isn't a problem. So if my toddler gets into it and munches it, it's no big deal. And the assumption, I guess implicitly, is that my toddler isn't going to put it in the toaster first, which would make it dangerous, okay? Because if it gets heated up, then it gets dangerous, or psychoactive, is that the term? So if that's right, and once we can get people kind of beyond the mental block of saying, yeah, we're going to take off the child protection stuff because this stuff really isn't a problem for your toddler, as long as they don't heat it. My question is, so this is a great idea. So what's the downside? Like, is it just the optics of this and just the education? So that's my first question. My second question is about one of your other recommendations, which I will call the there is only one box recommendation, the standardized packaging, okay? So my question is, how do you sell this, or will it be difficult to sell to the industry? Because as you all know, product differentiation exists. Packaging is a key part of product differentiation, kind of as a general rule, and it may play a key role here. So I can imagine that industry players might push back and say, you know, you're not allowing us to product differentiate, and that's a bad thing. On the other hand, the producers might say, oh, this would be great, because if you force us to all use the same, possibly boring packaging, then we won't have to compete on that ground. And in fact, we won't have to spend a lot of money trying to compete on funky packaging. So my question is, which of those two wins? Like, is this going to be an easy sell to industry, or is it going to be a really hard sell to industry? That's my second question.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for your questions. I'm going to take the first one about THCA, and then I'm going to pass it to Erika about the standardization. So I think you've actually summed it up pretty well, which is that THCA in its raw form, raw cannabis, can be consumed, and it might give you a tummy ache, but it's not going to poison you. It's not going to give you any of the euphoric or therapeutic effects that come with what's called the decarboxylation process, which is basically when you heat raw cannabis that contains THCA to a certain point, either with fire or with a vaporizer, it decarboxylates and THCA turns into THC. And so when it's in THC form, that's when you get the euphoric or the therapeutic benefits. That's when you feel the effects. But so when it's in its THCA form, it is akin to your favorite thing, which we know is kale, and doesn't give you, it gives you probably, it would give you the same effects of eating a kale salad, which is not a lot of joy. And so the real hurdle to this one, it's complicated, and it kind of, it speaks to the tension of our policy lab challenge to begin with, which is that there's a lot of political dimensions. There's the fact that the industry is young and was, I think Erika mentioned, they didn't have a lot of time to comply with regulation because this was a 2015 campaign promise that was studied by a task force, recommendations came forward, and then it was like the craziest, fastest turnaround for regulations that I think Canada has seen in many years. It maybe not, doesn't compare to some of the programs that have been rolled out in the last 4 months, but this was at rapid speed. And so with that in mind, we're not suggesting that, the child resistance is an oversight, because it's pretty standard. It comes from food and drug regulations, and we put child resistance on all sorts of things. But we add child resistance to bleach and to aspirin and to, prescriptions, because consuming them actually can really harm you. And it can harm kids and pets. And there's also a sort of interesting intergenerational argument that after a certain point, this is more from a US perspective, but we see more intergenerational families with grandparents living in homes or taking care of kids. And after a certain point, child resistance for older people is a real hindrance. So it's complicated. But what we found was that, the biggest sort of hurdle to this is that people haven't thought about it it hasn't really been explored. But if you take it if you ground it in science, it's not that wild. And then if you think of, trying to sell it to your minister in a political context, if you could eliminate inlaid plastic mechanisms and these clunky 70-gram plastic jars that are made of dark plastic and are probably landfilled, if you could eliminate 3/4 of what you're selling, switch it over to plain cardboard packaging similar to cigarettes, you would very nearly solve your plastic problem. So we're not suggesting that any of the high concentrated THC products change, because edibles, oils, concentrates, topicals, stuff like that, you can feel the effects, and accidental consumption, you would feel the effects. But this one is grounded in, science and trying to be, as an economist, rational, which is that child resistance is gonna work up to a point, and then if you're dexterous enough to open it, you're gonna open it. And if you're dexterous enough to use a lighter, you are gonna use a lighter. The same goes for if you're dexterous enough to put it in a toaster, you might start a fire. But we wanted to treat this, we wanted to explore how this shift in thinking would actually lead to real waste reduction. And we think it has tremendous potential.
Good, thank
you, Paisley.
Erika.
Thanks, Chris, for that question. To put this into microeconomics terms, right now there's very little product differentiation. So the industry is prohibited from using any marketing tools for safety purposes. So branding elements on the labels can still stay, even if there is a harmonized package. Obviously, there's going to be upfront cost, but there are long-term benefits. And in our research, we know that industry does actually want to shift towards less waste. Plus, there could even be benefits to the Canadian industry at large if we use standardized aluminum packaging or other materials sourced in Canada.
Thank you, Erika. Thank you, Chris. We have another question from our faculty member, Jennifer Welsh.
Hi, thanks a lot. Very, very interesting presentation. And I think what I like about the way you approached it, but also the project itself, is this notion of unintended consequences in policy making. And I think there may there may be some unintended consequences from your recommendations. And that's kind of what I wanted to ask you about with respect to the thing that everyone's talking about, because I think with the child packaging, I just wanted to make 2 points and get your reactions. One is when you say, Paisley, with respect, I get it mixed up, is THC is the one that you will feel the effects, right? You won't just feel the effects. It'll be very, very dangerous if it's used in high concentration, right? People can be hospitalized. It's serious stuff, right? And it can't, and there can be accidental situations where that occurs, but one could say that that's true of lots of substances. So coming back to Chris's question, have you thought about the issue of in what kind of concentration you would have to have a child essentially leave this stuff lying around such that it could be ignited and produce toxic, dangerous effects? Is there something about the quantities that this could be sold in that you would actually avoid that danger? So if someone came along and said, okay, maybe we buy the idea that there's a low risk, but there's still a risk. Is there then a response that you could bring that says, well, maybe we need to have these in a certain quantity that would eliminate even that risk? And therefore you have a kind of dual strategy to deal with the what if scenario. That was one question. I don't know if you followed me, but I'm just thinking about whether you could play around with amounts as well as the lid. The other is, do you see this as opening a Pandora's box, right? So when I think about the legalization of cannabis, because I have law enforcement members of my family, right? My brother-in-law and my nephew are both police officers. And they look at cannabis within a larger spectrum of things that go on, alcohol, hard drugs. And similarly, you reference kale, right? So there's a place in which cannabis fits in relation to other kinds of products. And when you raise this issue of the child-proof lid, do you see, if we went down this line or this pathway to loosen that requirement, whether it would have a knock-on effect in terms of a larger conversation about products which perhaps we have over-regulated? And would you be willing to say, yeah, it's time we have that conversation? And cannabis, just as it's been a leader in really pushing everyone's thinking about what should be legal, would be at the forefront of another conversation about changing behavior. So I'm thinking about unintended consequences that might actually be positive with respect to your case study. So
Thank you, Jennifer, for your question. Paisley, if you could keep your answer under 2 minutes, we want to have time for one last question.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. And I think that you bring up a lot of good points. Just to be clear, THC, which is edibles and whatnot, we are not suggesting moving away from child resistance, because as you rightly identified, if they're inadvertently consumed, they can do some damage. But in terms of the perception of what it's contained, we didn't really explore changing the volume of packaging sizes, but this is something maybe for THC products that could be explored. So if you eat a whole package, you're gonna certainly feel effects, but it's not gonna be as bad as possible. And there already are pretty strict limitations on the maximum amount of THC in edibles and whatnot. So that's being looked at, but I mean, maybe it's something to be reviewed in future. In terms of the policing perspective, one of the things that Omar brought up was that one of the objectives of the Cannabis Act was to stamp out the black market, the illicit market. And so right now we're seeing that legal cannabis can't compete on price. It really can't compete on price. And it has the fact that the packaging has led to like real reputational damage for both the legal market, the regulator, and producers, is something that may inadvertently drive people to the legal market, not only to the illegal market, not only because of price, but also because of the way that access to legal cannabis across the country really, really varies. It's so different in Quebec than it is in Alberta, for example. So those are a lot of features that we think that there's a lot of counterintuitive features of regulation that might actually help out the black market in some ways by creating this strong contrast. So maybe Omar might want to speak to that at some point, but more just finally about the perception of maybe this being overregulated. We really didn't want to bring up, you know, tobacco is a really problematic example, but there is huge inconsistency between the way that we perceive the dangers of alcohol, tobacco, and cannabis. Cannabis.
Thank you, Paisley. Thank you, Paisley. So we actually have an opportunity to have a few members of industry who are on the call this morning, and so I wanted to take an opportunity to ask for Mr. George Smitherman to provide some comments. George, perhaps as you introduce yourself, perhaps speak to us a little bit about your role in industry to give us some context.
Sure, thank you. Well, I'm a former regulator, having once served in the Ontario legislature and for about 5 years as Ontario's Minister of Health. So I sure relate to any comment about unintended consequences from legislation. And I think one thing that's important, particularly for people that aren't consumers of cannabis, to know that an unintended consequence of the Cannabis Act is that because of a limitation on being able to talk about the product and its effects and the limitations on branding, a lot of Canadian cannabis is being differentiated on the basis of how strong it is. And as a public health practitioner, I know that's not what we intended, but cannabis, which would be illegal in Uruguay because it's too strong, is not strong enough for the market that's emerged here. I think that's one thing we should be aware of, is that the distinct limitations on branding and advertising have also created an inability to talk about product and to create a sense of quality other than high THC count. This is a great paper, and I thank the team that's worked so hard on it. I just do want to mention that at the same time, the cannabis industry is being asked to develop strategies around the collection of the lithium battery from vape cartridges. So it's a reminder also that there are other streams, and as we look at strategies, perhaps there are opportunities to align those to create more effective collection models that rely on less carbon content. My question would be, with respect to point number 3, do you think that the preponderance of risk with respect to pre-rolls is exactly the same? Because I have a precocious little girl, she's going to turn 10 in 2 days, and I have a 12-year-old, and and I was a solo parent for 4.5 years as they were very young, and I do have to confess, sadly, that lighters sometimes, sometimes were involved, and I started to imagine this risk of dried flower, which I have in my household, versus the risk of a pre-roll, and somehow I differentiate those a little bit from the parenting standpoint. But anyway, the industry will look forward to taking an opportunity to respond to the conversation as it is ongoing, and there's certainly a lot to work with here. And I just want to thank Omar, who's been my liaison, for bringing me the opportunity to offer some feedback along the road. So thank you for all this great work.
Thank you, George. We really appreciate having you here. And I think this just stresses the importance of further collaboration between the industry and regulators and government across the board, in particular to all of our recommendations, whether it's the recycling program, whether it's removing child resistance from THCA products. I really think that the most important thing that we identified in our report is that there has to be communication. There has to be a dialogue between the industry and the regulator. And moving forward, seeing that the cannabis industry is at an inflection point is very critical that we move forward in a collaborative, inclusive way to build a better legal cannabis industry in Canada.